Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Okay, so on to the next topic of the session. Our next presenter is Srikanth Mangalam, who is with the Public Risk Management Institute, PRISM, in Canada. And Srikanth is going to talk about case for innovative regulatory interventions to manage safety and quality risks with global supply chain. So over to you, Srikanth.
Thank you, Vipin, and good morning to you all. I'm going to possibly disappoint you with my presentation because mine is completely non-technical after what you heard from Shankar. But I'm going to talk about the work that I do and we do as Public Risk Management Institute in the risk domain and specifically with respect to regulatory interventions. Let me start off by saying that I run an institute, which is a not-for-profit research and advisory organization that looks at the risks associated with complex interconnected systems that have an impact on our lives, livelihoods, and the environment. Healthcare is very much within that context. And universally, the notion of lives, livelihoods, and the environment are measured through and reported using the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we work a lot with the UN SDGs and mostly in developing economies in places like Africa. Our interest is really very much on looking at how the risks of systems that affect lives and livelihoods in these parts of the world are currently measured, how are they managed, and how are they addressed, particularly through policies and regulations. And so my specific presentation today will look at a case with respect to health, but the areas of interest where supply chains are significant are both food and health, interconnected aspects of food and health. So SDG 2, for those of you who may not be familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, talks about ending hunger around the world and ensuring access to food to all people, in particular poor people in vulnerable countries and economies around the world. With a focus on ensuring that the food that is accessible to them is not just available, but it's safe, nutritious, and sufficient all year round. So there are expectations that are set through these UN SDGs that countries are aiming to aspire to and achieve, including India. And the issue is the accessibility, where do we stand with respect to accessibility, but more importantly, where do we stand with respect to accessibility to safe and high quality food? And that's an area that is of interest to us. The way countries are measured in terms of where they stand with respect to that particular goal, they use a scale called Food Insecurity Experience Scale. That is based on a global survey that's conducted across the world in all the countries, using 8 questions that help people understand what's the access to healthy and nutritious food. And clearly, as you can imagine, that there is a disparity in terms of where the level of food security is around the world. And as the slide sort of shows, that places such as those in Africa are extremely disproportionate in terms of where they stand with respect to food insecurity, and supply chains play a big role in this context. So disruption in supply chains, especially post-COVID-19, have not only increased this disparity, it has created new challenges for places in Africa to be able to access food. So it's not just the accessibility problem. The moment you have an accessibility problem, you start having issues with the quality and safety of food that becomes available as well. This statistic keeps changing on a daily basis. Almost 1 in 10 people around the world fall ill after eating contaminated food. So even if you have access to food, the question of whether they're safe or not is questionable. And nearly 500,000 people die every year because of food poisoning. 90 million in Africa alone fall ill every year because of food poisoning. And just by sheer globalization and of the food supply chain, there's an expectation that the exposure to new and emerging risks with respect to food is going to increase by 2050. They're expecting 10 million lives will be at risk just due to antimicrobial residues, and it's going to cost the world a significant amount of money as well. And the WHO, for example, is focused on this particular issue. I'll talk. I mean, food on its own can be an enormously complex and difficult topic to speak to. But I'll just touch upon the aspects of health. The SDG 3 talks of about good health and well-being. Much like food, the aspiration, the global aspiration is that we achieve universal health coverage that focuses on access to quality and essential healthcare services. What I'm going to spend my specific time on is the access to safe, effective, quality, and affordable medicines and vaccines in countries around the world. And you'll hear a presentation from Professor Raj that'll speak to this next as well. And the way that the universal access coverage is measured is through an index called the Universal Health Coverage Service Index, which looks at a variety of attributes, including the current state and level of healthcare provided for the reproductive, maternal, and child health, infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases. But what I'm going to look at is specifically to do with service capacity and access, under which the access to essential medicine is covered. Unfortunately, as much as this index is useful and is able to measure aspects of access, it does not necessarily address the issue of safety and quality. So, while we might be able to increase the access to essential medicines around the world, the question of whether these medicines that are becoming available are safe and of a certain quality is still a huge challenge. And there's an information gap and deficit that actually varies depending on where you live in which country. The issue of substandard and falsified medicines has been known for many years and continues to be a cause for concern. However, it is not being dealt with through the SDG that I talked about. So substandard and falsified medicines, as you know, cause harm to patients, not just because they may not fail to treat the diseases for which they're intended to. Some of them may actually lead to other side effects. And these can cover a whole range of categories, including medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics. In terms of what we know, and we know very little about what the level of substandard and falsified medicines exist in the global market today. We know that antimalarials and antibiotics are amongst the most commonly reported falsified or substandard medical products. And as many of you might know, they also are contributing to antimicrobial resistance and drug-resistant infections. The WHO did a study a few years back to try and understand the prevalence and the extent to which substandard medicines exist in the market. And they found that in low and middle income countries, again, 1 in 10 medicines being supplied are assumed to be substandard. And again, in this case, the disparity is even more alarming when it comes to Africa, and specifically sub-Saharan Africa, which bears a huge brunt of failures in the value chain. So 42% of the reported issues come from Africa, double what you see in the Americas and Europe. The estimated burden on countries because of the prevalence of such failures is enormous economically. But more importantly, in terms of the impact on health, is huge. That they assume that over 70,000 child pneumonia deaths can be attributed to falsified medicines, and nearly 9 to 10% of malarial deaths, which still occur in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, are because of falsified antimalarials. The impact is not just on the economy and health, but it can be pretty widespread in terms of lost productivity, lost income, issues of social mobility. You see migration happen as a result extensively in many parts of this world. There's a complete lack of confidence in the medical system, for example. So you hear a lot of hesitancy in terms of taking medicines because of these issues. So there's a wide range of impacts that are not direct, but can be significant because of substandard falsified products. And where do the sources of failure occur? And those of you who are experts in supply chains will tell you that the failures can occur at any point along the supply chain, whether it's at manufacturing, whether it's during its transit from when it moves from one country to the other, or during the last mile when it's being distributed to hospital networks and clinics in different parts of the world. Just as an example, oxytocin, which is a drug that's provided for during pregnancy and childbirth, it was a case that was investigated, and they found that failures occur at the point of manufacture, both in terms of the ingredients that are used, during storage and distribution. And this particular drug requires cold chain protection, and because of lack of temperature control along the supply chain, there are cold chain failures that occur. So failures can occur at various points. And cold chain in particular has a huge bearing. The failure in cold chain can have a huge bearing on the quality and safety of medicines. It can reduce the potency or the efficacy of the medicines. It can cause unintended harm, as I mentioned. It also, in many instances, reduces the availability of these medicines for people to be able to access. Just specifically with respect to impact of cold chain failures, there are estimates that say roughly about $35 billion are lost annually because products are destroyed or destructed as a result of cold chain failures. And these numbers can vary depending on who's conducted the investigations. The WHO, for example, estimates that 50% of vaccines are wasted due to temperature control and logistic failures that support the cold chain. What are the root causes of these failures? And I'm coming to the point of where policy and regulations become a critical part, is that there is a well-known evidence to suggest that the regulatory systems that support the protection of such supply chains is poor or inadequate or absent in many instances. And it gets worse as you start looking at poorer countries, simply because of the lack of infrastructure and capacity. Some of the related aspects could be the way the procurement policies are set up in these countries, where they're looking for the lowest and the cheapest product available, given the cost of medicines. And so you end up procuring from fly-by-night operators and end up having poor quality medicines, etc. And the lack of consumer awareness in many parts of the world, that they don't realize that medicines can be substandard and falsified, and they don't end up reporting on issues that they may face. There is clearly a dual system of governance that operates. So, for example, products that might be shipped from a country like India, China to Europe or US follows a completely different set of governance and oversight mechanisms compared to products that end up going to places like Africa, etc. So there's a dual system of governance that exists. There's clearly a lack of international coordination. As much as WHO is trying to address this, they don't have the capacity or the ability to influence a coordinated approach to addressing these issues. Clearly, COVID has magnified the aspect of inequitable distribution of resources and supplies, whether it pertains to essential medicines like vaccines, etc. And the issues go on and on. But I'm going to focus specifically on the aspect of regulatory oversight. For those of you who are not familiar with what the purpose of regulation itself is, regulation, as you know, is aimed to provide protection to individuals, to businesses, to markets, to the natural environment from harm and from creating a fair and safe operating environment. There are two types of regulations that exist: economic regulations that help to create a fair and balanced marketplace and create efficiencies in the market, and the social regulations that help you achieve social outcomes. For example, addressing harm like health effects, etc. So the regulations do serve a very important purpose in hoping to achieve equitable access to services and goods. It creates a fair and responsible marketplace. It protects the environment, protects citizens and workers from harm, etc. And many of you know that. But there are limitations with regulations too. Firstly, where most of these countries that I'm talking about face is that there are constant conflicts between the economic objectives of the country with the desired social outcomes. So you're trying to increase the access to essential medicines and trying to get access to medicines at a cheaper cost. And then there's a conflict with saying, how do we balance that with making sure that these medicines are safe and of certain quality? Most regulations tend to focus on sectoral aspects. So, for example, if you think about a medical supply chain, you have different sectors operating. You have the pharmaceutical sector, you have the transportation sector, you have the logistics sector, you can have the hospital network. So there are different sectors that operate, and each of these sectors are regulated separately. So there's a lack of coordination. The supply chain is not seen as a system, and it's not regulated as a system. So you have single or sectoral risk environments. I talked about the competing social outcomes. So, for example, there may be an increasing pressure on certain jurisdictions to look at climate change issues. So they may have energy conservation issues, which might not be favorable for cold chain protection, for example. So there may be competing outcomes that affect this. There is also regulations don't keep up with technology, and you just heard a presentation from Shankar about issues of 5G networks. As innovations increase, the business models keep changing. The regulations are not aligned with them. How am I doing in time? A minute or so. Okay. So there are several challenges regulating supply chains, and there's several handoffs, hierarchies, interconnected systems, and most regulations aren't set up to deal with this. The last point I want to mention is with respect to information debt. One of the key aspects of having a good regulatory system is the need for good quality data. And because there is inequities in the way the technology is being spread around the world, data becomes a huge issue. So a country like Africa may not have as much data to deal with these challenges as a country like the US, for example. The last slide I want to talk about is that you're starting to see a shift in the regulatory landscape, where they're starting to talk about governance of systems, for example, as opposed to sectoral regulations. You're looking at a supply chain as a complete system and seeing how you can set up a regulatory framework that supports such systems, looking at focusing more on outcomes as opposed to processes. And there's certainly a lot of work that's going towards sharing of information between different jurisdictions. I'll stop there in the interest of time and take any questions.
Thank you very much. Maybe we have time for one question. Maybe I'll ask a quick question. What would be the North Star for this? What would be the desired model into the future?
I think the desired, there are 3 points. One would be an international coordinated approach. So I think beefing up the infrastructure and capacity of an organization in the WHO. The second is increased use of technology. I think there is an opportunity to leverage technology, particularly from the point of view of data sharing. If there's a shift towards using more technology in the space, I think that would be a big bonus in this context, especially when it comes to monitoring supply chains, for example, right? So that you have more real-time applications of technologies to be able to understand and find out the substandard false diagnosis. So international coordination through a central body like the WHO and more use of technology and data in the chips that would help.
Great. Well, hopefully we can make it happen sometime. So thank you very much, Mr. Srikanth Mangalam, for your talk and for joining us from Canada.